playing devil's advocate. You said that there was an immense tragedy when his son was killed by the drone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I'm just playing devil's advocate. Given the fact that he was so radicalized and his son was there with him in Yemen, isn't it a possibility that his son, the fact that he killed, well, not me, I'm not American, the fact that his father had been killed, would that have just...
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, there's a little more to the story than I shared. The 16-year-old Abdurrahman, born in Denver, lived with his father and his family for a time after they came back to Yemen. But then his father was off in jail in Yemen, prison in Yemen for a year and a half. And shortly after he got out, he went off to the tribal lands. And he actually Anwar asked Nasser, the father, Abdurrahman's grandfather, to take the former agriculture minister, to take care of his family. He said, living out in the tribal lands is not a good place for my family, so please take care of my family. So Abdurrahman, the teenager, had actually been raised mainly by his grandparents. And Nasser al-Awlaki, who's about 70 years old, told me was just crushed when his grandson was killed. He was obviously very distressed by the killing of his son, but he kind of, I think at some level, understood that Anwar knew what he was getting himself into. And but the kid was a different story. And so Nasser told me about, in the last year of Abdurrahman's life, so when he was about 15, the power goes out regularly. I'm sure more now, but has always gone out regularly in Sana'a, in the capital of Yemen. So they were sitting one night together around a candle. The lights are out in this big house in Sana'a. And Nasser al-Awlaki said, I told him, the kid, I want you to study hard, because when you finish high school, I want to send you to study in America. And I want you to follow my path. And what he didn't say, but was implicit in that, was, I don't want you to follow your father's path. And he said that his grandson, who was very fond of him, they got along great, said he would, said he wanted to do that, and that sounded great to him. What happened then was the Arab Spring broke out, and there were demonstrations on what they called Change Square in Sana'a, just like in Egypt, everywhere else. And this kid, who was 15, turning 16, spent a lot of time down on the square and kind of had, like, as you can imagine, a teenager in those circumstances, had this kind of political awakening, suddenly aware of all kinds of stuff. You can sort of follow this on his Facebook page, which I think is down now, but I got to see his development a little bit. He kind of begins to take an interest in politics. And anyway, so in early September, I guess, August or September, late August, early September, he gets up one day early, like 4 in the morning, takes some money from his mom's purse in Sana'a, because his mom is there too. His mom and his siblings are all living with the grandparents. And takes some money, leaves a note saying, I'm sorry, but I'm going to find my father. And catches a bus to Shabwa out in the tribal area. And because Shabwa is where his father had been living and where Al-Qaeda was most active. So he went to find his father. I think it kind of like makes sense of it all. Like, my father's this hero to some, but they're trying to kill him. And, I mean, you can imagine a kid, 16-year-old, who's trying to make sense of that. He wants to talk to his father. He hasn't seen him in a long time. So he's looking for him in Shabwa when September 30th comes, and he gets word, along with the rest of the world, that his father has been killed in a drone strike in Al-Jawf in the north of Yemen near the Saudi border. And at that point, I should say that, again, by all accounts, he was a very sweet kid, had no history of terrorism or militancy, and he was only 16. However, though some people would certainly deny this, including his grandfather, I think there's pretty good evidence that when that happened, you think of the picture that, you know, there were a lot of Al-Qaeda people around him because he was looking for his father, right? And it's a tribal place, and he's told the Americans just killed your father. Kind of, you know, what are you going to do about it? And supposedly he said, that's it, I'm going to join the jihad. Anyway, that probably was why he was hanging with Al-Qaeda people, and when the drone strike came later. So the Americans had no intention of killing him. What's funny about your question is that in Yemen, a lot of people don't believe this could have been an accident. And I can't prove that it was an accident, but I certainly have a lot of evidence that I believe that it was not an accident. They meant to kill the 7 people. They just know the kid was there, who they were. That's the problem with the drone program that I referred to, is that often the operators only have an educated guess as to who is on the ground below them, or below the drone, when they fire the missiles. And so, you know, in a significant number of instances, that becomes a problem. So that's a longer version of the story. Yeah.
In her book, What Terrorists Wants, published in 2007.
What, who wants, sorry?
The book.
Uh-huh.
Louise Richardson. I remember, I think the book title was What Do Terrorists Want?
Mm-hmm.
And she argues that it takes an alienated individual, it takes a complicit society, and it takes a powerful ideology to make a terrorist.
The first one was what kind of individuals?
An alienated individual,
Uh-huh.
someone who is alienated from society.
Yeah. Yeah.
So she mentioned 3 arguments: an alienated individual,
Mhm.
a complicit society,
Right.
and a powerful ideology
Yes.
to make a terrorist. But it seems from your presentation that in the case of al-Awlaki,
Mhm.
what really radicalized him was the U.S. foreign policy. It's not really the U.S. society as it is in terms of values, in terms of ideas or culture, but it's actually it's foreign policy
Mhm.
and then religion. So it's like an interaction between religious ideology
Mhm.
and
Foreign policy.
foreign policy that actually radicalized. So my question is actually a remark. Should we forget about trying to find a radicalization process within society itself, the causes of radicalization in the society itself, and look for states' foreign policies and focus also on religion to really understand what actually radicalizes individuals?
Well, for those of you who might not have been able to hear everything, she was saying that there's an argument that it requires an alienated individual, a complicit society, and a powerful ideology to produce a terrorist. And that in Anwar al-Awlaki's case, it seems to be foreign policy and religion. So you're saying maybe not the alienated individual part of it, or what?
What I'm saying is that maybe we should not so much focus on cultural values.
On cultural values, okay.
Understand hometown and international.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that cultural values played a role. I mean, I have to say, I spent a year working on the book, and I still couldn't say absolutely what radicalized Anwar al-Awlaki, but I know a great deal about it. I know a lot of the different elements in it. But, but sometimes you could still have arguments about what was the importance of American foreign policy in his, evolution versus what was his anger at being uprooted from a comfortable life and a successful career in the United States because the FBI had followed him to prostitutes. What was the element of sort of self-loathing that American culture had lured him into, these liaisons with prostitutes, which were completely contrary to what he was preaching and what he claimed to believe. So, what was the element of his own hypocrisy? What was the role of, his family would tell you that he was blocked at every turn, that he really ended up with Al-Qaeda once he was in Yemen because he couldn't really do anything else. That he had an American education, he should have been given a great job, but they wouldn't give him a job, so he ended up doing what he was able to do, and this is what he was able to do. So there's so many elements, even in this one man's case. So, I would be wary of ruling out any of the above. Usually there's some people who want to focus on, U.S. foreign policy. Often left critics of U.S. foreign policy want to say it's all U.S. foreign policy. Some on the right in this country, a lot of people want to say it's all religion. It's just, look in the Quran, you can find it all there, and that's what it is. I think it's a very complicated kind of witch's brew of stuff that produces a guy like this, and all of those elements are crucial, and part of that is, thank God, terrorism isn't more common. Certainly in this country, it's almost vanishingly small, vanishingly tiny, and so so I think that means that people respond to the same. If the Iraq invasion alone could turn someone into a terrorist, we'd have thousands upon thousands of terrorists. If going to prostitutes could turn people into terrorists, we'd have thousands of terrorists. So it's a very unusual mix of things, certainly in this country, and I think to some degree beyond as well.
Actually, it is kind of connected with the question that Helena made. You mentioned in the book a very interesting point that I agree with it, and I would like your opinion on it. You say that what is interesting in the United States compared to, for example, Yemen and Saudi Arabia, and you also give examples on how roommate, he went to Saudi Arabia, and then when he comes back and he finds him completely changed.
Yeah, so you've read this, you mean?
And,
yeah.
Yes, and you would think that that people that are coming from Yemen or are coming from Saudi Arabia, they would be more into the extreme end of the spectrum compared to people in the United States, but that's not the case, because in these countries, the society is stratified, is divided, so people that have the same type of technology and mentality, they would be grouped together.
Yes.
But in the United States, that is not happening.
They're all foreign students in the dorm. Yeah.
And they're with each other, so the radicalization is more, is going to happen more effectively compared to the others.
Yes.
Now, my question is this. You specified in the United States, but given the recent events, I find it as a very interesting explanation also for other countries in Europe. And I would like your...
Which explanation? Or
this combination of different strata of society, because there isn't this differentiation in status.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not... I'm just a reporter, really. I'm not an expert on this stuff. But the story that she's talking about that's in the book was, I found a guy through LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a great reporting tool. Because you can put in keywords. You have to buy a premium account or something. But anyway, you can put in keywords like Yemen and Colorado State and Saudi, and you can find people and contact them. And so I found a former buddy of Anwar al-Awlaki named Ghassan Khan, who is Saudi. And he was also doing a degree at Colorado State at the same time. They arrived freshman year, and by his account, he and a third Muslim guy from India, I believe, kind of hung out together the freshman first semester. You know what that's like. You show up at college and you meet your friends, and so they would have these various adventures together, and they were experimenting in the usual college way, And according to Ghassan Khan, Anwar al-Awlaki was, again, not interested in religion, was drinking alcohol, was sort of chasing girls and having a good time in the usual college manner. So then the Christmas holidays come, vacation, and Ghassan Khan went home to Saudi Arabia for, I don't know how long it was, 3-4 weeks or something. But Anwar stayed in Fort Collins, Colorado. A little bit of a bleak place, Colorado State, if you're staying on campus during the holidays. And he apparently hooked up with some older students and a group from Tablighi Jamaat, which was a sort of proselytizing, is a sort of proselytizing group. Anyway, he came under the influence of some very religious students and just went hook, line, and sinker for religion. And so when his roommate came back, they had agreed they would room together off campus second semester of freshman year. And his roommate comes back with a third guy. And his roommate comes back from Saudi Arabia. And Anwar has been completely transformed from the guy he was first semester. And among other things, Anwar thinks that TV is haram, is forbidden, and he's very against TV. And one thing that Ghassan Khan remembered was that he Ghassan Khan, who's pretty Americanized, wanted to watch the Super Bowl. And this really upset Anwar because of the beer ads and the scantily clad cheerleaders, which, according to Ghassan Khan, Anwar first semester wouldn't have minded at all. Anyway, then he came back another time, found him watching a movie on his own TV. This was Ghassan Khan's TV. And according to Ghassan, Anwar picked up the TV and smashed it on the ground. So Ghassan Khan moved out of the apartment, and that was the end of a brief but great friendship. But what's interesting about that, and Ghassan Khan made that point, he said that he was from a fairly secular family in Saudi Arabia, a fairly westernized secular family, and relatively speaking, and that he never met super religious Muslims until he got to Colorado State. And he thought the same thing was true of Anwar. I found that sort of fascinating. And his father once said, Nasser, the old man once said, Anwar's father, said, "What happened, happened in America." As you can tell from the story that I told, he wasn't, throwing everybody's TV on the ground from then on. That certainly planted the seeds of a kind of intolerant, radical brand of Islam, I think. He was sort of Salafi, basically, but I think he kind of grew up. That was like a new convert, more or less, being holier than everybody else, and I think he got over that. After that, he had good relations with non-Muslims, neighbors and stuff. He was friendly. He was, he seemed to be a more tolerant, more open-minded kind of guy for years after that. But that was his sort of introduction to religion, and you're absolutely right. It seems to have been related to the way that Muslim students from all different backgrounds get thrown together as they did at Colorado State, and that made a big difference.
I read that the NPR reported that Muslim scholars were not at all impressed with al-Awlaki's knowledge of Islam, even though he was so popular on the internet.
Yeah.
If you would, does your book? They came close to calling him a phony.
Yeah.
In terms of his theological knowledge. Does your book go into that? And also, in terms of the legal issue you discussed about killing an American-born terrorist that the Justice Department had to address, did you find out why they didn't just simply, or why they didn't revoke his citizenship, and then it would make a legal process a lot easier?
Okay.
They rejected
Yeah.
the citizenship of many other people who've done lesser things than al-Awlaki.
Okay, so two questions. The first one is about Anwar al-Awlaki's credentials as a scholar of Islam. And it's funny, when he had his website, anwaralaki.com, which is still cached here and there on the internet. You can find it if you hunt around. He had an Ask the Sheikh thing on his website. Ask the Sheikh, write in and ask your questions and I'll answer them. And somebody wrote in and asked him, tell us about your religious education, Sheikh. And so it was an interesting answer. Basically, and among other things, he had gotten a correspondence course from France, I think it was, and listened to some tapes or something. But he was very much self-taught. He also spent some time with a Saudi cleric named Salman al-Auda. And he spent some time in Hodeidah, where there's which is on the Yemen's west coast, studying in some kind of Islamic college there. But in general, I think it's probably fair to say that he was self-taught, and that most serious Islamic scholars don't have a high opinion of his scholarship. What he really was a popularizer. If you come from a different tradition, if you come from, say, the Christian tradition in this country, I don't know that Billy Graham, would be considered a great theologian, but he was a hell of an influential preacher. And so in that sense, he was a popularizer of Christianity. And he probably got a lot of the ideas more or less right, and he conveyed them in a compelling way. And I think that's basically what Anwar al-Awlaki did, although I think many mainstream Islamic scholars would say that, he conveyed some of it in a compelling way, and he conveyed some of it in a completely wrong-headed way, and has led many people down the primrose path to disaster. That's the story of his credentials. The second question was about, could the U.S. government have stripped Anwar al-Awlaki of his citizenship as a prelude to putting him on the kill list or killing him? Believe it or not, there is no procedure, no provision under the law for stripping a natural-born citizen. You can strip a naturalized citizen of his citizenship, but you cannot strip a natural-born citizen, someone born in the U.S. as a U.S. citizen, of his citizenship.
They revoked Mayor Kahana's citizenship.
Where was he born?
Brooklyn.
I think that's wrong, but you can check it out. Anyway, that's what I...
But he was a member of the Knesset, they revoked his citizenship.
They revoked his U.S. citizenship.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, you may be right about that, but what I've been told is that there is no procedure to do that, and that what they did do was they revoked his passport. And one of the, you can imagine when the President of the United States says, go find someone and kill him, to the $80 billion a year 16 intelligence agencies, they all start competing and working very hard to try and do that. And as somebody told me, to try and get little nuggets of information about Anwar al-Awlaki into the President's daily brief, the intelligence briefing that the President gets in writing every morning. And so there was this huge effort to find the guy, and even the State Department did its little part by sending a letter to Anwar al-Awlaki, care of his father, at his father's house in Sana'a, saying, dear Mr. al-Awlaki, please stop by the embassy at your earliest convenience because we have a letter for you. And the letter said, this is to inform you we've revoked your passport. And as it turns out, he didn't fall for that ruse. He did not show up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, do you think al-Awlaki would have been an ISIS supporter? Since the great schism between al-Qaeda and ISIS, mainly due to the slaughter of fellow Muslims, the concept of takfir and all of that, do you think he would have been an ISIS supporter or more of a strong al-Qaeda adherent?
Well, in some ways, the great chasm between al-Qaeda and ISIS is not that great. It's in terms of rivalry and so on, it's significant. But as you can see in different countries, the al-Qaeda affiliates are certainly saying, yeah, I think I'll go with with the winning team, I'm going to go with ISIS. It's not like there's a giant theological gap between these groups. But so it would have been interesting to see how that played out. You know, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has stuck with core Al-Qaeda, with Zawahiri and so on, and not gone with the new kids on the block. So presumably Anwar al-Awlaki probably would have been part of that. But he was a guy who was very into sort of prophecy, and so something that happened in connection with that is sort of interesting. In December of 2013, a video came out, a propaganda video in English came out from ISIS, and it was the usual kind of like, come join ISIS, and, you know, bring your family, and you'll be a hero, and look at the cool fighters, and, you know, slow motion guys, you know, spraying machine gun bullets and beautiful music, and the usual. But what was sort of shocking to me at first is that the voiceover, much of the voiceover, is from Anwar al-Awlaki, and his picture was down in the corner. It's like Sheikh Anwar al-Awlaki, and then and what he's saying is the creation of the Islamic State is a huge landmark in history, and this is so great, and you know, the people in the West will try to destroy it, and maybe they'll succeed, but in any case, maybe they won't, you know, and I think he says somewhere that every 100 years something happens, something big happens in the history of Islam, and the former caliphate, the Ottoman Empire, had fallen about 100 years ago, so it's about the right time for a new caliphate to emerge. And so when I first heard this, I said, oh my God, he's been dead. He's been dead for, what, 2 years at that point, and yet here he is talking about the Islamic State. But of course it turned out to be his tribute recorded in a talk he gave to an audience in Pakistan via phone line, I think, or via the internet somehow. In 2008, after getting out of prison, he addressed an audience in Pakistan, and he was referring to something that had happened when he was locked in Yemeni prison, which was the creation in October 2006 of the Islamic State of Iraq, which was, of course, the precursor to ISIS. And so he was praising this, but the language really made it sound like he was talking in 2014 or something, you know, 2013. And so it was sort of shocking. But, you know, that does make me think that he would have been very tempted. And I can, you know, and again, an ambitious guy who would probably want to go with a winning team, I would not have been surprised if he slipped away from Shabwa province in Yemen and turned up in Raqqa, Syria, you know, to say, hey, you know, I'm with you guys. But the other thing I'll say about ISIS and Anwar al-Awlaki is, I think they learned a couple things from him. One is just the power of media and the crucial role of the internet and all of its various tools for recruitment. And the second is do-it-yourself terrorism. Osama bin Laden always had this notion that you had to go big and have a big 9/11 style attack, right? And I think al-Awlaki figured out that that was not going to work. He knew the U.S. very well. He knew what had happened to the defenses of the U.S. And so his whole thing in Inspire magazine, the whole pitch is do-it-yourself jihad. And some of the ideas are nuts, like weld blades onto the front of your car and drive into a crowd, or put oil on the road on a curve so that, you know, the cars driven by the infidels will slide off and crash, you know, just crazy stuff. But like I said, there were also the bomb-making instructions that the Boston Marathon guys used. But that notion of the kind of do-it-yourself jihad, and the idea especially that if you're in the West, you should just stage an attack, don't ask for orders, don't wait for instructions, just do it, that is definitely carried over to ISIS. And while there's some degree of control in Paris and Brussels, you know, it's kind of, it seems to be very loose control, and they're totally happy. Like when these two guys showed up to shoot up a Prophet Muhammad, a sort of provocative Prophet Muhammad cartoon contest in Texas, last year, I guess it was, and or the San Bernardino couple. They're totally happy to take credit for something that ISIS had no idea was coming, because they want to encourage this sort of, self-help model to jihad, and I think they kind of got that from Al-Awlaki as well.
I'd like to ask you a question and sort of make a point. One of the things that is remarkable is how much you learn about Al-Awlaki. So that, you talk to his father, you talk to other family members, you're able, and it was partly because he was American, but you, and then the FBI records and everything. It is astonishing. I mean, even Lawrence Wright in Looming Tower is always one step removed from understanding Bin Laden as a man. It's very indirect, much of his reporting. It seems to me that there are a couple of things about him that are suggested by what you discovered. And I mean, you noted the going to prostitutes, and a lot of people go to prostitutes. But you also say that he was arrested by the FBI for loitering near a school, that suggests a degree of sexual perversion, and suggests a kind of a self-loathing that,
yes.
that he fled because he found out that, he fled the United States in 2002 because he found out that they had this file open on him. But the kind of, just the tension, the psychological tension in him as he's becoming this great figure in Islam, and he's the go-to guy, and the terror that must have been within him, which somehow is also connected to this that conversion experience. Our colleague Scott Atron found that always in interviews, just always that sort of conversion experience. You have which is, that's how many years before 97 is the conversion experience?
Well, meaning throwing the TV on the ground and all that stuff? That's actually in 90.
The 90s.
Yeah.
So, to go through that, it's very, it provides a kind of it's only one person, but it provides some biographical insight that is very suggestive for sort of dissociative kind of levels of dissociation and openness to these radical ideas. The other thing is the diaspora effect. What you said about the Muslims in Colorado State collecting together and finding themselves finding radicals there more likely than in their home country. And that's like Mohammed Atta going to Munich.
Exactly.
And becoming much more radical in Munich than he ever was in Egypt. You get away from your home base, you get away from your family, you get away from your community, and you're more open if you're psychologically and politically ready for that, to take in that kind of message. If you're away from the home, you're more open.
Yeah. I lived in Greensboro, North Carolina for a few years, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the chief planner and organizer of the 9/11 plot, had been a student at A&T State University in Greensboro, North Carolina, and I talked to some of the people who were students there, Muslim students there at the time he was there, and they said that people would actually talk about them dividing into the mullahs and the playboys. And the mullahs were people who reacted to being in the U.S. by becoming more religious, more, home, native in their dress, not native U.S., but native to their homeland, and more, less likely to drink and so on, and clustered together. And the playboys were like, oh, thank God I can drink, and I can chase women, and I can do all the things I'm not allowed to do at home. And there was a real schism between those two groups. But your comment about being found loitering near a school, that's always intrigued me, and I was unable to...
He was actually arrested.
He was, which is strange. I mean, one thing that he did do was he picked up women in red light districts in San Diego before he moved, and he got arrested twice in San Diego propositioning police women posing as prostitutes. And later he addressed this actually in Inspire magazine, I guess it was. He said that he said he acted like it only happened once, and what happened was he was at a red light and a woman came up to the window and knocked on the window, and he rolled down the window and she said, "You're under arrest." That was his version. The police version was he was cruising looking for a prostitute in a known red light district, and this woman came up and they had the usual exchange, and usually the target of the sting has to say something about how much you'll pay or something. There's some kind of rule, and then she would make the arrest. So, and given his behavior in Washington, which was extremely well documented, I think it's fair to say that his excuse making that the FBI was somehow entrapping him was probably not correct. But I really have wondered about, because, for example, he says in that Washington Post video from November 2001, in explaining Ramadan, he says Muslims abstain from 3 things during Ramadan from sunrise to sunset. One is sex, sexual activity, he says. And so imagine, what does it mean to find in the FBI surveillance records, they're following him around day and night, right? And usually in the afternoon, he would disappear from the mosque for a couple hours, and he would drive into DC, and he would show up at a hotel and have a meeting with a prostitute that had been arranged through an escort service. And he did this right through Ramadan at like 2 in the afternoon, right? So, the tension of hypocrisy there, which is, of course, well known in this country among certainly Christian preachers, in terms of, all the TV preachers who've been caught in various scandals. Not to mention Catholic priests who are pedophiles and so on. I mean, there's just a huge history of this, of course, but the tensions that come along with that, especially I think if you're a preacher before a big congregation, and this guy was, I think beloved by the older generation because he had good Arabic and was, respectful, and the young people liked him because he was kind of cool and hip and spoke good English, and and so he was becoming this big figure, and yet he was skulking off to these hotels, deceiving his wife. And here's a guy who's preaching about the sanctity of marriage on Friday, and then maybe later the same day or the day before, or the day after, going off to the Wyndham Hotel. And so the tensions there must have been very powerful.
Robert, if you take Al-Awlaki and Timothy McVeigh and the older Tsarnaev brother, there are similarities among the 3 of them. Failed careers. McVeigh failed the Army Rangers and his goal of becoming Special Forces. You have him being exposed, his career as a imam or preacher being overturned. And then the Tsarnaev brothers' boxing career and his education down the tubes. So you have these, these failed people that seem to embrace this radical version of Islam, almost as a crutch or something to hold on to, a sense of themselves, a rebirth of themselves in a way. And I just noticed that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, I think in his case it was also the ambition. This was a guy who really wanted to leave his mark, who really wanted to be great. And I think that was tied up a little bit with his relationship with his father. His father had been a great man in Yemen. He'd been agriculture minister, he'd been chancellor of 2 universities, founder of 1 university, very respected, big deal, big guy. And he had gone against his father's wishes in not pursuing the engineering career. And then his father kept pestering him to try and get a PhD in something. And he agreed to he enrolled for a PhD at George Washington University when he was in DC, in educational leadership, I think it was called. And And even after he left Washington, inexplicably to his father, I think he told his parents that, geez, it just got too rough for Muslims after 9/11, so I'm moving to the UK. He didn't, for obvious reasons, level with them. But then he looked into getting a PhD in the UK, but they couldn't get the money together. He originally had a Yemeni scholarship to go to George Washington, and so it just didn't work out. So there was this kind of failing at what his father wanted him to do, and yet the ambition to be somebody and maybe to prove to his father that he could be somebody. And his family would say he was blocked at every turn. And there's, I think that's kind of excuse making, but there's an element of truth to it. You know, that in the Yemeni cultural context, his uncle in particular, who's a wealthy businessman, told me that, who knew Anwar very well, told me that, you know, in Yemen, a guy who is, you know, goes to America and gets a degree and comes back to Yemen, you know, is a rarity and speaks fluent English, perfect English like Anwar. That's a rarity, and that they should have given him, they, meaning the government basically, should have given him some job. He should have been deputy minister of something or other. He should have been somebody, but they wouldn't give him a job, partly because of pressure from the U.S. or wariness on the part of the U.S. And so he did what he could, and this was the last thing left to him. That's their version of it, and I don't think that's completely wrong. His younger brother, Anwar al-Awlaki's younger brother, Amr al-Awlaki, who also was educated in the States and Canada, and a super nice guy who was extremely helpful to me on this book. I think 10 years younger, quite a bit younger than his brother. He is, I guess technically still, the deputy minister of water and the environment in Yemen. The country's in a civil war now, and so, you know, the government's not functioning. But he took that job in 2014. So he actually became, you know, a deputy minister in the government, and sort of was following the path that his father, their father, had wanted Anwar to follow.
Yeah. We're doing a pretty good job of psychoanalyzing him and looking into the root causes of his behavior.
Yeah.
But since you mentioned that there are religious aspects to this conflict, would you describe him as evil?
You know, I guess I'm not a religious person, and I don't find the term evil to be that useful.
Even given that situation.
I mean, a guy who wants to blow up an airliner of 300 strangers, to me, is evil. But to call him evil doesn't help me to understand why he wanted to do that, you know what I mean? So I don't find the term particularly useful, but certainly in colloquial terms, I would find him to be evil, yeah. Although he's sort of he's sort of an attractive evil character. He's, you know, I mean, as he's proven over the years in life and in death, he's a very inspiring, captivating, enrapturing guy. When he had his website, you know, there was a comment function, and so he would put up a post, and for example, Nidal Hassan is a hero was a post after the Fort Hood shootings. And it's fascinating to read all the comments, but what they have in common, and people argue and stuff, but what they have in common is a fairly worshipful attitude towards Anwar al-Awlaki. So, you know, you and I may see him as evil, but I think many people saw him in a different light. And I'll make one other point, which is, you know, I said that one reason I set out to write this book was to understand what motivates a terrorist. Something that's not, you know, for most of us is quite perplexing on its face. And of course you can get into definitions of terrorism which are also often politically dependent, but one thing that helped me understand this, and this is something I put in the book and I'm shocked that I haven't gotten some flack about it, but one of you can give me some flack if you want. it helped me to understand what was going on here when an former FBI counterterrorism agent once said to me that he thought some of the would-be jihadi guys, terrorists, who recruited in the United States, who were radicalized in the United States and got arrested or blew something up, might almost as well have joined the Marines. And what he meant by that was that they were motivated less by religion than by the search for identity, the search for a cause, a noble cause, and the search for adventure. And so, you know, be all you can be, as the Army recruiting slogan goes, what the Marines are what, the few, the proud, the Marines. I mean, these guys are the few, the proud Al-Qaeda, right? And so when we send usually young people off to fight in wars, they sometimes kill large numbers of civilians, usually not intentionally. But we welcome them home, we call them heroes, we say thank you for your service, and we treat them with a kind of, as almost a kind of sacred, military duty is almost a sacred thing that deserves everybody's respect, no matter what. And I think if you think about somebody who is a devout Muslim and has replaced the idea of loyalty to a nation with loyalty to the Ummah, the global community of Islam, of Muslims. And you say, the way an American Marine might say, I had to go fight because, you know, I had to go fight in Iraq because Saddam Hussein was going to come kill us here, and I had to protect my fellow Americans, and I had to defend them. And as they used to say, we had to fight them there so we don't have to fight them here, and so on. I mean, there is a commonality, certainly, with the idea of someone who joins Al-Qaeda because the United States is killing his fellow Muslims, and he has to fight back. It's his religious duty, and that's what you heard Anwar al-Awlaki say. It's their religious duty to fight back against America because it's killing Muslims. And one, it goes, well, certainly I believe that the notion that the U.S. is at war with Islam is bogus, and that the notion that the U.S. is killing Muslims is grossly oversimplified. But it's also true. When bin Laden announced the U.S. was at war with Islam, it was the 90s, and no one really knew what he was talking about. I mean, I think it was hard to figure out what he was talking about. After 9/11, we invaded Afghanistan, we invaded Iraq, and we started carrying out drone strikes in Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia. So we were literally killing Muslims. And since that is the core recruiting argument of Al-Qaeda, I mean, I think that's part of the loop that we've gotten ourselves into, that I made reference to at the beginning, this notion of the backlash. When you kill somebody with a drone, whatever else you do, maybe you've eliminated someone who's very dangerous, who was about to kill a lot of Americans, but you've also killed a Muslim, or 5 Muslims, or 10 Muslims, and therefore you've played into the Al-Qaeda recruiting pitch, which is the Americans are killing Muslims and you have to join us.
Yeah, I've just been noticing a pattern with kind of all the seminars that we've had here of how terrorism kind of disrupts rationality. As far as the U.S. goes, we had a speaker talking to us about medical personnel and their protection of wounding treating the wounded, but that goes out the window with terrorism. We had someone come in talking about cost-benefit analysis with security and how that, even though they had the receipts, like that goes out the window with terrorism. And here you showed us a video of Obama kind of like, let me get this straight, you know, U.S. citizens all have, you know, the right to, you know, but when it comes to terrorism, again, that goes out the window. So I just kind of wanted your opinion of what that is.
How terrorism sort of promotes irrationality or undoes rationality on both sides, you're suggesting? Well, I mean, that's an interesting point, I think most of the people on both sides of this conflict would take issue with that. They'd say, on the Al-Qaeda side, they would say, wait a minute, the US invaded Iraq and was killing Muslims, so we had no obligation, we had to defend Islam, we had to defend the Ummah, so it's totally rational and totally justified. And Obama wasn't saying that he was throwing out the Constitution. He was saying he believes American citizens do have due process and cannot be killed without due process. What he doesn't explain is that he accepted the Justice Department's legal opinion that said that the secret assessment of the threat posed by Anwar al-Awlaki and the decision to put him on the kill list, that was sufficient due process, that you didn't have to go to court, that you could give him, due process on the Constitution. So he wasn't throwing out the Constitution, in other words. Some people disagree with that interpretation, but Obama was certainly not saying, I think the guy's a jerk and so I'm going to kill him. So people would take issue with that. But you make an excellent point. For example, another thing that motivated me to write this book is how the United States has been changed by the post-9/11 fear of terrorism. And there are many elements of that. But the US, as an official policy, renounced and denounced torture, for forever, basically, for years and years and years. And every year, the State Department would come out with with a human rights report where it criticized other countries for engaging in torture. Ditto for extrajudicial killings. As late as July 2001, you can find Colin Powell. Who is it? It is Colin Powell and others denouncing Israel for targeted killing of Hamas operatives, saying it's counterproductive and you really shouldn't do this, kind of bumping off of terrorists. Even if you think they're terrorists, you shouldn't do this. Well, 9/11 led to what? Torture. Although the Justice Department wrote in legal opinions that were later withdrawn that it wasn't torture, I think it's, certainly some of the methods the CIA used met every historical or common sense definition of torture. Secret detention, which had always never been done before. Extrajudicial killing with the drone, which we'd criticize in Israel. So, we changed our principles, so to speak, or violated our principles, or however you want to call it. We changed in fundamental ways, on fundamental issues as a country, as a result of the fear of terrorism. And if your argument is that terrorism sort of unhinges people, I think there's some truth to that. One of the things, this is sort of counter to my interest, I suppose, in selling books, but terrorism is a vanishingly small threat to your security here in the United States of America, as you undoubtedly know. But according to, it depends on how you define things, but the New America Foundation has done a pretty good job of, rigorous job of trying to count terrorist deaths, meaning politically motivated violence, ideologically motivated violence, since 9/11, the 15 years. And I think the current total is 45 jihadist and 49 other, white supremacist, militia, other kinds of wacky ideologies. And that is, so the non-Islamic ones outnumber the Islamic ones by a little bit of a margin. But the larger issue is that there have been 220,000 plus homicides in the United States in that same time. So if you take, fewer than 100 against 220,000, you got to worry in this country, but you don't have to worry about terrorism.
I was just going to ask you, mentioned that you spoke to his family.
Mm-hmm.
Now, did they ever mention specifically attempting to dissuade him from pursuing that path?
The three people in Anwar's family who would talk to me were his father, who took some convincing, Nasser, his brother Amr, who I mentioned, younger brother, and his uncle, who's not really his uncle, but he's his father's cousin, and he basically treated him as an uncle. And they gave me huge amount of help and huge insight. The father would not talk about this, but I know that he did try to dissuade first he tried to keep his son from being an imam, and he did talk to me about that. He said that in Yemen, imams are basically a dime a dozen because there's no formal requirement for training. Anyone can just say, I'm going to lead prayers now. And so there's lots and lots of people calling themselves imams, and most of them don't make any money from it and don't have much prestige from it. So I think his father thought, oh my God, we sent him off to Colorado to get this degree in engineering, and he wants to be an imam, And I think in the American context, an imam actually has higher status. But so he tried to talk him out of that career course, and then later he wouldn't talk about this, but he definitely tried to talk him out of the more and more radical line that he was taking. I mean, the father sat with me and said at one point, as I say in the introduction of the book, I loved America. And then he said, I still love America. And it was so deep with him that this country, he talked about landing in Kansas as a Fulbright scholar. He was taken to Kansas to do some English study. And he said the first impression was he went to the cafeteria and there was all the milk he could drink, which he'd never imagined, never seen. And anyway, and he loved it. His son told me he would get up at 5 in the morning to watch Larry King live on satellite TV. And he loved America, and yet America had come and killed his son and his grandson. So that was a terrible thing, but he definitely tried to talk his son Anwar out of his views, both because he violently disagreed with them, and because he thought he was going to get himself killed, which he did.
So you talked about looking at what makes a terrorist and about a process of ideological change. I think you kind of implicitly said that there has to be this change, this radicalization process that a person goes through, that al-Awlaki went through, and certainly some of his followers go through as they progress from that educational videos about just basic Islamic education to more radicalizing propaganda. So recently, I think the whole concept of radicalization is so controversial at this point. And this week there was an article in Foreign Policy called Europe's Joint Smoking Gay Club Hopping Terrorists.
Yeah.
Brothers
Yeah.
in Belgium. And it made the argument that there was no evidence that they had radicalized, that just months before the attacks they were seen in clubs, partying, and saying, in Europe, with regard to ISIS recruits, maybe there is no radicalization, maybe it's just criminals or people of that mindset, maybe it's Islamicized radicals rather than the other way around. And I'm just curious, do you think there are different tracks? Do you think this is Europe versus US or ISIS versus Al-Qaeda? Or do you think that that's just wrong and that they must have radicalized?
That's a great question. I don't have a great answer. I mean, you put it very well, and what you're describing is sort of a puzzle. I guess one thing that I would say is there's a kid who some of you might have heard of named Zachary Chesser, young guy named Zachary Chesser, who I talk about in the book. He was a big fan of Anwar. Chapter 9, I think it is. I kind of step aside from the narrative and I talk about radicalization. And I talk about sort of, what I see as some of the patterns in radicalization and specifically what made Anwar al-Awlaki such a potent influence. And this guy, Zachary Chesser, he's a kid from Virginia who first he got into breakdancing, and in his very multinational, multicultural school, high school in Northern Virginia, there were a bunch of Korean kids, and the Korean kids dominated. I think were basically all the in the breakdancing club, but he was the one non-Korean in the breakdancing club. And then he got into I think heavy metal and goth and stuff, and he was but when he would get into something, he'd get into it whole hog. And then he met a girl, always, the danger, look out guys, who was Muslim, And he went for Islam so crazily that I think she dumped him eventually. It's like, oh my God. But he became so enamored with the kind of, Al-Qaeda brand that he was arrested trying to fly off and join Shabab in Somalia, and is serving prison term now. And said actually in court, who knows if he was sincere, but basically said he didn't know what had happened to him, like, what had come over him. It was like he had passed out of that stage, but it was kind of too late because he was off to prison as a result of that phase. So, I mean, I think one thing that's happened is that jihad, violent jihad, Al-Qaeda style jihad, not as the kind of traditional religious term, but violent Al-Qaeda style jihad, has become a meme in the culture, right? So even if you're Zachary Chesser and you didn't know the Prophet Muhammad from anybody, a couple years ago, now you are more Muslim than anyone who is born Muslim. You can grab hold of it and use it as your identity, right? And I think there's an element of that in a lot of these guys, in Tamerlan Tsarnaev, in Nidal Hassan. Both of them grew up Muslim, but I think they seize onto this and say, like, this is my cause, this is my meaning, this is my life. And so, the guys, there is a pattern, of course, with Nidal Hassan, among others, and with Muhammad Atta, of going to strip clubs and then going off to commit your suicide mission. And that is, I think Chuck can explain that one later on, but that does seem to be a little pattern. Whether that shows that they've actually radicalized, and this is sort of the yin and yang, and they're being pulled in two directions, and this is tearing them apart and making them so, distressed that they're willing to kill, or whether they're just hypocrites, or whether they're not radicalized as you suggest. They haven't really absorbed the ideology. They just, know that they can say ISIS, ISIS, ISIS and kill people, and they think that's a cool idea, and they don't feel like there's much meaning to their life anyway. Who knows? But that's a fascinating question.
Okay, before I end, as we approach 5, I just want to make a couple of announcements. Most importantly, the books are here for sale. And Scott Shane will sign them. But we are right at the end of the semester, and I don't know how many of you are actually graduating, but we have, it's important that if you are graduating to let Chris know. Does everybody know Chris? If you're graduating, do let her know, and all of you are invited. We have a party. I always say at the center, we try to study terrorism, responses to terrorism diligently and work hard during the year. But what we really do well is have parties. So our party, our end of the year party, is May 6th. Friday, May 6th. So it's about 3 weeks from now, or 4 weeks, whatever that is, from 4 to 7. I'll get a notice out, but I want you all to remember that, and we have a little ceremony where we honor. That's one reason we want to be sure we know all the people who are graduating. We have a ceremony and food. And anyway, you'll hear about it. But anyway, that's what's coming up on May 6th. So is there anything else? No. And again, Chris, Serena, give her mention about graduation. So this was really interesting. I love the idea of a jihadi meme. That may be the what we're dealing with the internet